Okay, is the board, everybody, board ready? Okay. Board ready?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the board. Thank you so much for letting us present today. I'm Marilyn Marks, Director of Coalition for Good Governance. You're familiar with both petitions that we will be presenting today, ballot secrecy as well as the logic and accuracy compliance rulemaking petitions. We've been here before. We have tweaked slightly the last rulemaking petition that we put before you at the October meeting. So I won't go through all of the rationale for why we need secret ballots, why we have a violation today. You all are very familiar with that. But as we start this discussion again, we should remind ourselves that across all modern democracies in the world, the right to vote a secret ballot is considered a human right in international treaties. Our nation's foreign relations laws say that governments that are elected without protected ballot secrecy are not to be considered democratic nations. We all know it is a hard-won right to protect every voter in the country, every voter in Georgia, but Georgia has stripped away that right, not by law, but by permitting the Secretary of State to adopt and deploy a voting system that violates a host of laws. But this board has not felt compelled to return that right to Georgia voters by simply making rules to enforce Georgia and federal laws. The U.S. Supreme Court has recognized the right to a secret ballot as a fundamental right. Federal HAVA laws require secret ballots, and the state constitution requires it. Your own rules acknowledge the importance of a secret ballot. In fact, your own rules state that it is a constitutional right. But somehow, the board seems to be taking the view, never mind all those superior laws or the Constitution, or what the Georgia statutes require in absolute ballot secrecy. We want to merely comply with a small portion of 21-2-300 requiring BMD ballots and ignore the conditions of that law. That BMD use law is certainly not unconditional, but it is in the way it's being interpreted by this board. Ballot secrecy is an urgent matter that needs to be taken up right away, and voters need to be protected as we head into probably the most contentious election in our lifetimes. We all know voters who don't really like one candidate or the other of the likely presidential candidates in 2024, but they feel pressured by family or bosses at work or their pastor or their landlord to vote for a particular candidate. But they cannot vote their conscience in Georgia because of the unconstitutional voting process that essentially requires them to publicly display their votes, where their pastor, their boss, their controlling spouse may see it. There's no doubt that some authority figures are abusing the illegal system of voting in Georgia right now. And this board is duty-bound to stop the illegal voting method because, not only because it's illegal, but it is immoral to force people to vote in public. At the October 3rd board meeting, you told us that the board needed to study this ballot secrecy issue some more. That was also the board's response in February 2020 when we asked you to make the same rule changes. Any study would have revealed that 4 years of voting experience has found no method of effectively shielding voters' votes on the touchscreen. At the last meeting, you said there are other ways to ensure ballot secrecy. Whatever they are, they need to be adopted today. We implore you to act to adopt those methods before the 2024 election cycle. You've acknowledged the constitutional right to vote a secret ballot in adopted rules as recently as 2021, when you were adopting rules for the early processing of mail ballots. Yet, the board continues to deny our repeated petitions for rules to vindicate and protect that constitutional right. And the board's position seems to be that it cannot adopt regulations counter to the statute. But the statute certainly requires ballot secrecy. The rationale seems to be we will allow unconstitutional conditions to exist on voting because the Secretary of State chose a system that violates Georgia Constitution, federal law, and Georgia statutes. We will just adopt whatever he chose to buy. The Dominion touchscreens certainly fail to meet the conditions of law. The law authorizing the BMD touchscreens is conditional. They have to meet a host of mandatory statutory conditions, ballot secrecy being one. But the system does not meet those laws. We beg you to stop this anti-democratic violation of Georgia law. At the October meeting, you expressed that you only had two options with our proposed rule: to accept it word for word, comma for comma, or decline to adopt that rule for rulemaking process. We thought we were clear at the last board meeting in encouraging this board to suggest amendments. If there were any amendments that you thought were appropriate that could certainly be proposed, we're here ready to take live amendments and are, ready to agree with them if they're friendly amendments. So we don't say that you need to adopt our rule as proposed, word by word, comma by comma. We're looking to protect the voters' right to ballot secrecy, and it cries out for resolution before this contentious 2024 election cycle begins. Not more study, not more deflection of the problem with the false notion that current law requires touchscreens regardless of their violation of a host of federal and state laws. So from there, if you have some questions about our proposed rule on ballot secrecy, I'm happy to take that now. We tried to modify it just a bit to address the questions that you had last time, and taking decision-making about ballot secrecy out of the emergency realm. And that was a concern, I believe, Chairman Mashburn, you had last time. You were concerned that somebody would be trying to do that at the polling place.
Yeah, and indeed, that was what I was about to ask, is can you take us through the changes that you've made? Can you highlight those for us, please?
Okay. We got rid of the notion in 2C. We got rid of the notion of emergency situation, and we are just saying that, and of course emergency situation is it's a creature of this board's rulemaking. It doesn't exist in the statute. The statute that speaks to when you have an impossible or impracticable situation is not at all related to an emergency. And in fact, the very example given in the statute is one that wasn't an emergency at all. And that is when there were more candidates that would fit on the ballot, the mechanical ballot, and they said, okay, you got to go to a hand marked paper ballot. And that was well understood long before the election. The other a change that we also made in C is to make it clear that if it is legally impossible or impracticable to use the touchscreen or the voting system, that clearly is permitted to as an impossibility, so that you do go to hand-marked paper ballots. I know that some members of this board previously have taken the position that you must use touchscreens so long as they are physically operating. Doesn't matter if they're operating accurately, but so long as they're physically operating, you got to use them. That ends up with an absurd result, of course. And we're saying, let's make it clear. If they're legally, functionally, or physically impossible for use, go to hand-marked paper ballots. That the determination of an emergency should be at the discretion of the board, the election superintendent, as we talked about before. Or you had asked previously about the word official designee. I think we're consistent in saying, consistent with other rulemaking, in saying that official designee of this county board should be someone like an election supervisor, an official, not the random guy that wandered out of the bar last night
Okay,
and into the polling place.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but just to have a dialogue with you, what about a poll manager?
I think a poll manager in an emergency situation makes sense, but probably not in a non-emergency situation. That's the way we've tried to write it. Generally, Mr. Chair, what we've seen is when the rules require a designee, it's a typical use that this county election board designee is the election supervisor for a host of things, whether it's accepting a complaint that comes in and signing for the board, or conducting the logic and accuracy test, that the official designee is doing it, while the statutes themselves tend to call for the superintendent to do it, but we don't expect the superintendent to be the hands-on manager.
Because I remember the dialogue that we had previously, and I appreciate you addressing it, and the issue still in my mind is one of the worst things you could possibly happen in an election is for something to change while the election's going on. And so I've always been concerned, and I'm always concerned that everybody thought that this is the way it was going to be the day before the election, and on the day of the election something changes, and that's just catastrophic. So tell me how tell me how your proposal does not create a problem where I've got different precincts all throughout the state of Georgia making decisions.
Because again, we're asking the superintendent, which is generally going to be the election board, right? They're meeting in public session. They don't meet suddenly, at a precinct at 10 o'clock on election day. They are making their decisions ahead of time. And, but generally they have an official designee to handle a lot of the managerial decision-making.
So
And that is their election supervisor.
So under your proposal today, what's the last day before the election that this decision can be made? What's the final cutoff for making this decision?
We certainly don't have a magic date because boards meet at different intervals, but presumably it would be the last board meeting of that county board before voting goes into place, where goes into effect, where this might be affected, whether that's early voting or election day voting. Yeah, what? Yeah, Jeanne says that she has an answer to that as well.
I addressed it in my remarks, which I haven't delivered yet. But I've watched a lot of the practical cycle.
Let's let you get to a microphone, one way or the other, so that the court reporter can take it down.
So I'll come back to my prepared remarks later.
I get yelled at if somebody talks without a microphone. So.
Okay, and I'm Jeanne Dufort, the first vice chair of the Morgan County Democratic Committee, and I have been engaged in the local cycle of how you prepare for elections. So your question about what the last day is a useful but not practical question. In fact, being ready for election day is it is not an impulse-based set of activities. It is a planning-based set of activities. So the process of determining polling setup happens well in advance. A large number of counties rely on actual planograms. They may be informal, sketched out on paper. Sometimes those papers don't exist if a polling place has been used for enough time that, quote, everybody knows how it's going to be set up. But when a piece of equipment is designated to go to a polling place, right, there's a lot of process behind that. So in order to put put this rule into place, which we're recommending, it requires a local understanding of all the 22-odd hundred different shapes and sizes from those cinder block buildings in South Georgia that, you know, that they are, right? You visit them, to State Farm Arena. There is not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to polling places. So local knowledge, what I can do, what are my sight lines, where are my doors and windows? All these things go into preserving ballot secrecy, as you've seen from the pictures we provided to you, right? So it is literally not the case you can make a one-size-fits-all rule. That has to be, and our rule designates that, to the local person who knows their polling places. So here's what they have to do. They have to assess it for each and every polling place. How many of these can I set up protecting absolute ballot secrecy, considering windows, shape, size, number of polling stations I'm required to have, right? And they make decisions. Practically speaking, it will not be the knowledge of the local election board. It will be the knowledge of the local election superintendent. They're the ones, the administrator, who makes those decisions, supervisor, in consultation in a big county with their team. So, for example, Athens, with 100,000-ish voters, they've got Lisa, who's been doing this for a while. She isn't their election director, but she's their person who does all this stuff, figures out how it's going to be set up for each and every polling place. So there's a plan. Now, once you have the plan, you've got to figure out what machines have to be logic and accuracy tested for which ballot styles, right? That's part of the plan. How many ballots do I have to order? Right now, they have to order enough for mail ballots plus to meet your 10% rule for emergency paper ballots. So now they're going to have to look at the order. If this XYZ precincts need stations set up for hand-marked paper ballots, they're going to need more ballots, right? So there's a series of plans. This will not be an impulse decision. But I can tell you an anecdote that I personally observed of why a poll manager should not be prohibited from responding to the absolute requirement of preserving ballot secrecy. I arrived to poll watch at one of our fairly small polling places. The station set up for people who need wheelchair access, right? The accessibility station was sitting there facing the 3 chairs allocated for poll watchers, the only place available in the room for us to sit. So we were sitting where we were told to sit and where we were supposed to sit. The station was mostly not being used, and then a voter came in. And we looked with horror. I mean, this BMD screen was closer to me than Dr. Johnston is close to me, staring straight at the 3 of us. The 3 of us looked at one another and we're like horrified. We're like this, whatever. The poll manager observed it. Okay, voter leaves. She turns around and immediately comes and turns it in another direction. There were only 2 possible ways to turn it and retain wheelchair access, right? So she turned it. We couldn't see it anymore, but she stepped back and realized every voter standing in line to enter the room could now see it. So she turned it back and told us, don't look. But that is both an example of how difficult it is in practice to protect ballot secrecy, but why you would want a poll manager who walks into a room and decides, despite what we planned on paper, this isn't working, to be further instructed to do her best to protect ballot secrecy, because that is the only rule that is covered by the state constitution and the federal constitution and the law, right? That cannot be subrogated to other things. Does that makes, it's a long-winded answer, but does that make sense?
I appreciate your answer.
And I just want to make the point about the, we definitely need to keep emergency decision-making related to other issues. The poll manager comes in and the pipes have burst and the touchscreens are flooded. She doesn't need to have to convene a board meeting to try to deal with that. So you do need emergency operations to be done on the spot live when something happens. We were trying not to get rid of that, but at the same time permit hand-marked paper ballots to be used under that same statute for ballot secrecy. Hopefully that's clear.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Are you Did I interrupt your presentation, so you're still going?
No,
or
no,
are we
you
ready
asked,
for
no,
board
no, I was
questions?
done with the presentation
Okay.
and I asked you for questions.
Very
And
good.
you asked me about the rule here.
Very
So-
good. I wanted to give you a chance to finish before I turned it
Okay,
over
all right,
to the board.
any other question for
Yeah,
me?
yeah, exactly. Questions from the board?
Yes.
Dr.
Was that a yes or a no?
Dr. Johnson has the floor.
Okay.
So Ms. Marks, or Ms. Defort, either one. I like the dedication to ballot secrecy and the positioning of the BMDs. In looking at your proposal, the distance requirements between one BMD touchscreen and another of 8 feet would automatically disqualify anyone using the Runbeck hubs that are used throughout many of the counties now, because they have 2 or 4 BMDs that are less than 8 feet between. So that some consideration of that would be an automatic disqualification or reversion to hand-marked paper ballots if you followed this rule.
May I address that?
Sure.
Okay, what we were trying to say, now, we don't love those hubs for lots of reasons. You're talking about what Fulton County and Cobb County have, the big rectangular boxes? Right, okay.
I am.
And, you know, what we were saying was 8 feet between the center of adjacent touchscreens. And I'm not sure that we would think of, you know, how they are on each side, that we were thinking of those as adjacent touchscreens.
Right. The larger hub that is made by Runbeck, that's used in Fulton County, has 2 BMD screens next to each other,
And in that,
probably not 4 feet apart. So it would be an automatic
correct. One of
disqualification.
those would be down, but the two on, one of these would be, yeah.
Okay. The other question is the restriction of 30 feet for an individual to walk in front of a BMD while someone is voting,
I guess we would
Positioning?
call it behind.
behind.
Yeah,
Yes. There are polling places that are contained in a room that is less than 30 feet.
exactly. And it's a problem we need to acknowledge.
So the entire polling place would be disqualified for use.
I don't think so. No, we're talking about, we're suggesting that no one be able to walk behind the voter, voting, right? But within 30 feet. So take those small polling places, many in rural areas, what we would envision is that you would have one touchscreen facing every corner, so that you would have at least 4 touchscreens there. The voter would have his back to the corner, and then you're right, it's impossible to put any more. That's why we would say then most of your voting stations would be hand-marked paper ballot. But the idea would be nobody could walk behind me if I'm the voter, have my back to the corner.
I see. And the third distance parameter that you've added is no such officer may not stand within 6 feet of the polling place scanner during operation by a voter. I must say that practically speaking, Ms. Dufort, so many voters need assistance or questions or have difficulty or think they will have difficulty inserting their ballot into a scanner that it would automatically disqualify this rule.
There are 2 answers to that. One, your person who's stationed to watch the scanner, have them stay more than 6 feet away and only approach when a voter needs it. But the other thing that most states do for scanners, and in fact, we've got some counties in Georgia that do it, and that is create a ballot secrecy folder, envelope. And
Exactly.
all it is, if you think about it, is a manila folder cut with a little inch of it cut off. You put your ballot in that, you hold that folder, it's with the tab of the ballot sticking out at the top, and it feeds it into the scanner.
I like that suggestion. Florida uses that, and it's very effective and
Very typical.
And acknowledges the respect that a ballot deserves for secret ballot voting.
Right.
All right, another question, just a logistics question. So you have the ballot secrecy, you've rearranged voting hubs or BMDs, and now the line is too long, it's 30 minutes, and there's a desire to resort to or revert to hand-marked paper ballots. In early voting in Fulton County that has 360 precincts thereabouts and 1,000 ballot styles in early voting, I have a hard time imagining the logistics of having that many ballots, paper ballots, available for use. So it would require at least a ballot on demand printer in every early voting site, or packs of pre-printed ballots, because you have to maintain the proper precinct for each person that's voting.
Correct. Okay, so thank you for both of those questions. What we would envision going back to, we don't want to see the lines back up and say, oh, okay, now we have to go to paper ballots. We would want to see the setup with voting stations anticipate that the majority of voting is going to take place with hand-marked paper ballots. And so it would all be set up ahead of time. We wouldn't wait until the lines backed up. But in terms of the paper ballot style management, absolutely. You are going to need to be able to have ballots available for every ballot style. And Fulton County would be the biggest challenge, but states and municipalities do this all over the nation. But when you look at, it's been a while since we've done it, but we did some quick and dirty numbers on Fulton and looked at the various early voting locations in Fulton. And we determined that basically, in almost all of them, with 20 ballot styles, you could take care of 70% of your voters, because people tend to vote at the same voting location in early voting year after year, either where they work, where they live. It's quite predictable. The top 20 ballot styles, about 70% of your voters, then have ballot on demand printers, which are not nearly as fancy as they sound like, for your one-off. If you've got an Alpharetta voter that's voting down near the airport, which is going to be rare, but you still need to accommodate them. And Dominion has a laptop ballot on demand application that can just be hooked up to a cheap Office Depot printer and create ballot on demand with an official ballot created by the Dominion program on the spot. This is not new technology. This is already purchased by the state, and it's in the system.
Correct. They use an HP printer that's about this big now for ballot on demand printing. I think it costs about $900.
With the Dominion markup?
Well, maybe $3,000 for the Dominion markup. And it would require for a county like Fulton County to have probably 35, one for each early voting site, and other counties that have fewer voting sites, but they would need a ballot on demand printer, and they would need, and that would be an additional record keeping and accounting of how many ballots are printed off of those ballot on demand printers. There has to be documentation
Yes.
and recording of such actions.
Right. And that's, other states have learned how to do that long ago. But not only that, but the amount of money you would save by not having the plethora, the 35,000 very much more expensive touchscreens to set up, test, transport, secure, etc. You would end up saving so much more money. You could buy a new HP printer for every election and toss the old one in the landfill and still save money.
I yield the floor.
Dr. Johnson yields the floor. Board Member Lindsey?
Just a couple quick, in addition to the practical concerns.
Mr. Lindsey, we can't quite hear you.
In addition to the practical concerns that Dr. Johnson raised, just a couple of points of clarification. Number one, the argument that we have, or that we ever have, ignored the right to a secret ballot because of the electronic voting is patently false. We have a strict rule that requires secret ballots. We have a state law that requires secret ballots. We have admonished counties when a complaint has been raised about secret ballots, about the positioning of electronic machines not affording people with secret ballots. As a matter of fact, y'all were at the last hearing when we did just that.
But it didn't work, that was the problem.
And, well, it didn't in that situation, and we took corrective action telling them to stop.
The corrective
Hold on.
action didn't work.
Well, we don't know that yet. We don't know that.
We do.
They haven't had a vote since then. So we don't know that. So right now, what we have is a strict law, strict law that requires secret ballots. We also have a requirement by the state that you conduct your votes by electronic. That sets a clear mandate to the local governments, to the county governments, to operate your electronic ballots, in a way that protects people's secrecy. You made a point of going, well, we take a look and see whether or not the other things need to be done. I have taken a look. Quite frankly, I like that strict prohibition. There's no exceptions. There's no way to get out of the use of electronic ballots by using well, we got to do privacy. No, if the state has mandated electronic, state has mandated private secret ballots, and so you've got to conform to that, period. And they've got time to do so. So for that reason, I think that clear line of demarcation, which I believe is being watered down by your proposed rule change, is something that is disappointing. And so that's why I have some concerns with that from a policy standpoint, in addition to some of the practical concerns raised by Dr. Johnson. And
So,
please
Mr.
feel free to
Lindsey,
respond.
we don't understand how you can do both. We have never seen it work in Georgia. We've gone through 4 years now. No county has been able to both protect ballot secrecy and use the touchscreens. And, I would respectfully disagree. The law does not say you will unconditionally use touchscreens. It
didn't
says
say that.
you will use touchscreens that protect the absolute secrecy of the
And I
ballot,
agree
and we
with you.
don't have those.
And I agree with you. And that's something for the Secretary of State to deal with, and something for the local counties to deal with. But right now, we've got a strict rule that involving both, and you're absolutely right. But right now, it's up to them to come up with we've given them the discretion on how they do it, because different counties are different configurations and precincts are different, and so we've got to give folks a certain amount of leeway, as long as they recognize the importance of
we
a
would
secret, hold on, as long as they recognize a secret ballot. Now, please.
We would respectfully disagree that people have got leeway on whether or not to protect the constitutional rights to ballot secrecy.
Actually, I've said just the opposite. They don't have any leeway.
Right, but if they absolutely physically cannot use the touchscreens, and that is in most situations, the rooms are not big enough, they can't do it, then it is impossible, impracticable, and
Then they need to get another room. Then they need to get another precinct. Then they need to change.
not everybody can use a State Farm Arena. It is impractical. I mean, the idea of saying we are going to make these counties go get enormous gymnasiums for every precinct in order to accommodate our non-compliant touchscreens is not what the law presumes. And so,
Now, what the law presumes is that you find a location that also meets the requirements of
It is,
of a secret
it's
ballot.
certainly.
I'm sorry, but that's what the law presently requires, and if a county's not doing that, that's another issue altogether.
That would seem to take things to an extreme and absurd place. There are many counties that don't have a single public building that would accommodate. I mean, we go to rural counties all the time and see their precinct facilities, and many of the counties wouldn't even have a single building that would accommodate a number of voters and the machines. And to say, well, you need to build new buildings to accommodate these machines because they don't comply with basic rules. Now, Ms. Dufort and I were sharing the presentation time, and we haven't let her do her presentation. Shall I stand aside a minute?
Please do. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. I wouldn't have even started if you hadn't finished.
Sure,
My
absolutely.
apologies.
Absolutely. Make yourself comfortable.
That's okay. And although Marilyn and I are good friends, I am standing here before you representing the Morgan County Democratic Committee. Thank you, George. All right. I just have to say, wishing something is so does not make it so. So you are right. There are absolutely clear laws about protecting ballot secrecy, and you are right. There is a law that says use these ballot marking devices for in-person voting as long as they comply with all other laws. In your October letter declining it, you said, point 2, we already have rules, no additional rules are necessary. I'm guessing maybe you were the draftee of that, because that is the position you're taking today. But there is a trove of evidence before you in our petition, in the filings in federal court, that violations of ballot secrecy are routine across the state and continuing, right? Because I represent a rural Georgia county, I am going to take the position that we don't have lawbreakers as our election directors across the state. We have seen them try hard. We have seen counties like Fulton spend millions of dollars in this effort to figure out how to meet the rules, right? These rules that are out here. They have not, it's not because they have not tried, but there is a part of this for which this board, I'll say this board because you are the current caretakers of the board, right? You're not the people who always sat before you. In 2020, when this board responded to Athens Clarke County was the first board to really try to meet the 3 standards that have to coexist: protect ballot secrecy, deploy 1 voting station per 250 voters, and keep the equipment available for view to be sure there's no hacking or malfeasance going on. Those are all 3 rules that coexist. They tried so hard. They had meeting after meeting, planogram after planogram. They really worked it and came to the conclusion it was impossible to meet that standard, and they took action. This board showed up in Athens within a week of that, threatening them with large fines. The message that the state election board sent that day was heard all across the state. The message was the state election board will punish any county that does not comply with universal use BMDs, but will not punish a county that fails to protect ballot secrecy. Prioritize universal use over ballot secrecy. That was the message sent by action of the state election board that day. I was at that meeting. I was at many of the election board meetings that led up to that meeting and saw how hard they tried. And the finding of that board was not that you could protect it. The board did not figure out a way to solve it. The board said, try harder. So here we are almost 4 years later. And all across the state, people have been trying harder. But do you know what I hear that they will not tell you? I have heard from many election directors. We heard the message of Athens. We don't want to be Athened. They call it that in private conversations, election directors. We can't raise this issue with you or we'll be Athened. They're scared of you. And that is why you have an obligation to take an affirmative action to send a different message, to contradict the message that you put out into the universe on that day with that decision in Athens Clarke County. You know, I was going to talk to you about why it matters. It really doesn't matter why ballot secrecy matters, because it's the law, right? There isn't any other area where when we talk about the law, we say, well, if it's too hard, we can just break the law. If it's going to cost too much, we can just break the law. It is not a conditional right, the right to ballot secrecy. And you created the circumstance right now where the counties have a clear direction from the state election board, whether you like it or not. Your predecessors created that condition, and that's more than anything else is why you have an obligation to act right now, so that you're not burdening those local election officials with being lawbreakers. By the way, SB 202, let's talk about that. SB 202 says it subjects all of us, me as a poll watcher, election workers, subjects us to the charge, to felony charges. We can be accused of intentionally observing a voter in a manner that allows them to see votes. On that day, that anecdote I told you earlier, I could have walked out of there with felony charges because everyone knew that that screen was in front of me. We could not see it without turning away and not doing what we were there to do, which was observe elections and observe activity and observe voters, right? That cannot be the standard that you allow to rule. You have to protect election workers, you have to protect citizens that are walking into polling places, and you have to protect voters, right? We'd say where I come from, everybody knows your name. But they're not supposed to know how you voted unless you tell them. It's not okay. But it's also just not the law that says it's okay. And you have to undo what you did, you the board, your predecessors, what you did in 2020, or things won't change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was the only member of the board who was there in Athens that day, so
That was a day, wasn't it?
Dr. Johnston and Board Member Lindsey are exonerated and absolved from that, but I remember at the time examining the meetings of the Athens-Clarke County Board of Elections, and they couldn't even approve their minutes. They couldn't even get a vote to approve the board's minutes. So that board was in a lot of dysfunction. The chair and the election director had a major dysfunction and trust issues. So there was a lot of dysfunction going on in that board of elections at that time. So we'll just let the transcript from that hearing speak to that. I do want to ask. This is probably for Ms. Marks, but just to correct the record, Ms. Dufort brought up the rejection letter that was sent from the October meeting. And in your presentation on the first page, it's stated that the understanding that the previous petition was denied because the board determined that they had had not enough time to study the problem. And so I took no offense from that. We had a lovely conversation before the meeting started, so no, I'm not mad or anything, but I went back and reviewed my letter that I sent denying the petition, and I don't recall that being one of the rationales listed at all. And it's the only one listed here, so you and I are not going to be the only one reading this document, so I just wanted to correct for the record that.
Right, well, my comments related to what the board decided in the meeting. I think if we went back to the transcript of the meeting, that was the rationale, the primary rationale that you needed more time to study.
Okay, so just wanted to correct that on the record. And then me personally, just speaking for my own self, the petition was over, if I recall correctly, over 300 pages. So I spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours upon hours studying it. And I know the board is very conscientious in their work, and so they studied it as well. But I'd like to go back to Ms. Dufort and just be real clear with each other. And I appreciate your candor. I absolutely, totally appreciate your candor, because it would be easy to try and say this problem doesn't exist, but I think we owe ourselves the respect to have a dialogue about it and discuss it, and if it's a problem, it's a problem. And so let's go back to the example that you gave us, where the poll watchers were in a poll on election day, and they came across this problem. And so am I correct or incorrect that under this proposal, the poll manager or the election superintendent would decide on election day that ballot secrecy cannot be met, and therefore we're switching to paper ballots on election day?
No, I would say you're incorrect,
Okay.
because
Explain it to me.
under these proposed rules, that polling place would never have been set up the way it was. Understand, it was set up to the best of our election director's ability to follow one voting station per 250 voters, right, set up in a manner that they could be observed against hacking and protect ballot secrecy, right? And she had a given space. So she set it up to the best of her ability. Under this proposal, she would make that, and she doesn't want to be Athened. That's a fact. I've had that conversation, right? Under this proposal, that polling place would never have been set up that way to begin with, because that condition would have been recognized. She would have had the direct charge to protect ballot secrecy, absolutely, and set her polling place up with a mix of stations, however many ballot marking stations she could possibly set up. I don't disagree that that is a priority, right? But she would then stop to the extent, because see, you don't need 8 foot apart when you're voting, marking a ballot by hand. So she would have the flexibility to push more stations close together, separate the ones that needed protection because the big screen needs protecting, and we would never have been in that position. But I'm just saying to you also, practically, I never, ever want to take away the authority of the poll manager to respond to actual on-the-ground conditions to make voting better and more legally compliant for all voters.
Okay, and so back to Ms. Marks now. So are you and I clear, Ms. Marks, that your proposal is that the deadline for this determination to be made is the last board meeting before the election, whenever that board meets?
As a practical matter, you know, I would certainly look to the judgment of the board, but generally, I would say that the deadline would be when they are doing their final approval of the layouts of the precincts and that sort of thing. You know, if their board meeting's 5 minutes before early voting starts, no, it's going to need to be before that. I would leave it to their judgment as to making this decision at the time that they are setting up their polling places, approving the setups, approving the hours, and that sort of thing, and not try to nail it down to the last, say, oh, it's the very last meeting. They may need to have an emergency meeting about something else. We don't want to wait that long. But they understand what their problems are here. They know. The example that Jeanne just was using, I'm sure that it was well recognized that if they tried to cram all of the machines in the voting place, that there were going to be problems. When this poll manager and the superintendent could have said, okay, our accessible voting station is going to be facing a corner. We're going to have plenty of access to have wheelchair access into here. And then the rest of the voting stations that we need will be hand-marked stations other than in the corners. They would have that concept in mind well ahead of the time the poll watchers showed up.
Okay, thank you.
Certainly.
Other comments from the board?
Just to ask, and I have talked to a lot of different counties. We go out and visit with them and we chat with them. Has anyone joined in your petition from a county election board?
We haven't asked them to.
I
mean, we could have, but when we do talk to election supervisors and superintendents, board members, they tell us many of them tell us, we completely support what you are doing, but we are not about to speak up and be fined by the state election board for saying that we need to do this. We have a lot of silent support about this, but I'm not coming to you saying, trust me, they're all behind us.
Yeah.
They know that they will be punished if they speak up on this.
Because frankly, that's just patently false.
Well, they
hold
feel,
on, let
it
me
may
finish,
be.
let me finish. You
It
had
may
your
be,
moment.
but
Let me finish
they
mine.
feel that way.
Let me finish mine, because I have talked to them, and I have made a point, and others on our board have made a point, that we are in a collaborative phase, that we work well with them. We worked well with the county that was out of compliance before, and worked with them in terms of working a solution rather than fining. We
can't hear.
Sorry, guys. And that we have been in a collaborative phase, and we have asked, and with other folks. And I haven't had folks, and a lot of what we do is going, okay, guys, if the law's not working, what needs to work? Because our job is to then go back to the legislature and then, be your mouthpiece with the legislature. And we have sat down and sat with many supervisors. And in terms of simply coming to us and saying the present thing doesn't work and therefore we'll fine you, I think it's just patently false. I'll tell you that much right now. There's,
well,
for one
okay.
thing, there's no ability for us to do that, and number two, there's no incentive for us to do that. So that's just my comment.
Okay. But the legislature has addressed this. That's the problem here. It is only the state election board that has not addressed it. The legislature's been incredibly clear about it. They say the touchscreens that are to be purchased must provide absolute secrecy of the ballot.
I agree.
And so they've done their job. The problem is that what they ordered in the law is not being enforced by this board. And the rules don't comply with what the state and federal authorities ordered. And you talk about how you had one county who you've talked to and they began to try to address it, but we know enough about the little shields that they are going to use in the setup to know that that may be a nice try, but it will not be effective. It just, the physical properties are going to keep that from being effective, so we shouldn't pretend that it's going to be effective, and we shouldn't pretend this is a legislative problem. And we shouldn't say, well, we'll just wait until the secretary recognizes that he's out of compliance with the law. It is really this board's duty, responsibility, particularly as we're facing 2024, to say, okay, we must act and recognize the secretary's out of compliance, the equipment's out of compliance with all the laws. It's up to us.
I'll let you have the last word.
Dr. Johnson?
Just a few comments. Indeed, ballot secrecy is a priority, and it is a requirement, and it is the law, and it can be a problem, especially with the large touch screens. It could be a problem with paper ballots too if they're not protected for privacy also. For the people here and those that are listening to know, 44 states use hand-marked paper ballots, and that's kind of the elephant in the room. I know this petition for this rule amendment is about secrecy, but it's the elephant in the room because the consequence of not meeting the ballot secrecy standard is to revert to hand-marked paper ballots. I think we just all should acknowledge that it can be done. This petition led me to, or required me to start visiting places that were using hand-marked paper ballots. There's nothing to be afraid about with hand-marked paper ballots. I traveled to Orange County, Florida, and witnessed the use of Orlando, Florida, in using hand-marked paper ballots. And in fact, the entire state of Florida requires such. So it's not that it's dangerous to use hand-marked paper ballots. It's feasible to use hand-marked paper ballots. With that comes the additional requirements of security of that method of voting, I will, if we had that, I would lose as much sleep over the issue of security of paper ballots as I do over the issue of using BMD big screens. So that being said, the conflict is with the Secretary of State, who decides what voter system the state uses. And so that's the issue here, is it's the Secretary of State's decision, and it's the question really goes to either the legislature or the Secretary of State as to whether they would allow the use of paper ballots like you're proposing in this rule. So it's all tied together, and I don't think we as a board could implement this rule because of the effect that it would have on the manner of voting that is a decision of the Secretary of State. And I really have no issues other than some of those distance requirements. I'm not afraid of hand-marked paper ballots. I think we could certainly use them, but it's in the hands of the Secretary of State, in my opinion.
Dr. Johnston, could I address that for a moment?
Yes.
I would respectfully disagree that it is in the hands of the Secretary. The law is pretty clear, or is quite clear, that the Secretary can only certify a system in Georgia that meets all of the Georgia statutes. The Secretary certified the 5.5A Dominion system, where it violates Georgia law in a number of places, including ballot secrecy. The role of this board is to enforce the law. That is really clear in the statute, in its mission. This board must enforce the law. It is not up to the Secretary to make up any old system that violates the law, and then we all have to live with it just because the Secretary violated the law in certifying the equipment.
Well, Ms. Marks, the question today is whether to accept the petition for the rule amendment. It's not a decision on the Dominion voting system, which is a debate for another day. The issue here today is whether to accept these rule changes. And I think we need to keep the focus on the petition.
And if the board is ready to make a motion, the chair is inclined to hear it. Is there a motion? Y'all made your presentations? Okay. Is there a motion? Okay. Is there a motion? I'll make a motion. I move to reject this petition. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, we're ready to vote. Dr. Johnston, on the question to reject the petition. Now, how say you?
Aye.
Dr. Johnston says aye. Mr. Lindsey?
Aye.
Mr. Lindsey says aye. I say aye. So the motion to reject the petition carries unanimously. We'll now move to the second question, and that is logic and accuracy testing. Right?
I'm sorry, what was you say?
We're up for logic and accuracy testing?
Yes, logic and
Okay.
accuracy.
And so that is tab 51 in the board's